So that's nearly 30 years ago. But I suppose pottery has been pretty important in my research life, really throughout. Actually, pottery almost put me off archaeology completely, because it was about just over 50 years ago that I did my first ever solo excavation of the kilns of the New Forest, and confronted, and I think Chris and I shared recollections about the masses of wasters that kiln sites produce, faced with a leaking university old garage in University Road, Southampton, this great mass of pottery, and I thought, oh my goodness, So I started looking for, jobs elsewhere, looking in the bank, looking here and there. But anyway, somehow sense prevailed, and the pottery didn't defeat me, and here we are. So you've asked me to kind of speculate about the next 50 years, that's, I think that's quite a challenge, because in so many ways things are moving so very fast. And in that period, since the implementation of PPG-16 and then all its successors, archaeology has been transformed, and it's affected the shape, the way pretty much the way everybody works, and it's the emphasis, particularly I suppose, on excavations in the countryside as opposed to urban, because urban excavations are becoming so expensive. Developers largely, except of course in London, unable to afford the knock-on costs. So a shift to rural settlement, villages, so-called small towns, that kind of thing, has dominated Roman archaeology in Britain since 1996. And it's obviously led to questions about synthesis. How do we make all this information, all these reports more accessible? And of course, one attempt to do that was the Rural Settlement Project, which I think formally finished in 2018. And I mean, there were thousands of sites that we collected for that project. And I don't know if you've read any of the Britannia monographs associated with it, or delved into the website hosted by the ADS. But actually, one of the problems we came to was in the volume on economy, was to try and kind of make sense of all that mass of pottery data that was out there. And it actually came as a great disappointment, as our postdoc researchers struggled with what there was and how to synthesize it, how to put it in a form where it could be interrogated in lots of ways. And the lack of systematic approaches to description of fabrics, identification of fabrics, is reference to door and tomba, different approaches to quantification. All those things made it actually impossible to do very much with what I suppose collectively over those, well, because our research took us back obviously before 1996, but huge amounts of work, but so difficult to make sense of. But I sense that over the last few years, and with the more recent sort of guidelines that have been produced, that we are getting a bit more systematic. We are presenting data which can be, sites can be compared one to another, like to like, and that's really encouraging, because without agreement, so without knowing that we're talking about the same thing and the same terms, it's very difficult to move forward. So whenever there's another rural settlement project, which inevitably there will be, because the data's already, since we finished collecting in 2014, the data, there's a huge amount of new information out there, and of course of consistently better quality. So let's hope that the next generation round, one can do much more with the pottery data than we did. So if you had a chance to look at the rural volume published in 2017, you'll see that we looked at Samian, we looked at sites without, amphora, that kind of evidence. And then we had one or two more focused studies. So Jane Timby did a study based on her own collected data. So we were confident of the quality there. And Stephen Rippon did a synthesis on Eastern England. That all helped to focus and help us to understand what role pottery might play in sort of issues of debate around social and economic issues. So one's conscious of that. One's conscious now too of what's happening now with the government spending untold sums of money on these infrastructure projects, of which of course HS2 looms most in our minds and is consuming, what is it, they talk about a budget, this is before post-tax, of something like £100 million or something like that on archaeology alone. Huge opportunities, but huge challenges, I think. And I suppose I've got, I don't know, half a dozen sort of headings in what I wanted to say. And one was about really the lack of people to study the material that's going to come out of all this work. And I think we've already seen the pressures on our subject, on Roman pottery, as specialist areas dwindle. So, you know, we're all concerned about the loss or the approaching loss, if you like, of expertise in, and I can see Jeff's face or half of his face on the screen now, the issues around Samian and Samian research. But prior to that, you know, we lost David Peacock and David Williams and their work on fabrics and their work on, above all, David Williams's work on amphory. And you know, those are significant losses and have not been replaced. And as the specialist role has become increasingly rare, so I suppose people have had to become really strong generalists to know as much as they can about their own regions and then about the wares which have national and international distributions. But it is a problem, and I'm often asked, you know, why aren't there more students studying Roman pottery? And you know, I wish there were, but in the last 50 years, as we all know, the subject has grown in archaeology, the subject of archaeology broadly has grown in complexity, and you know, the whole field of bioarchaeology which was barely there. I mean, I don't think, I have to confess to this, did I did flotation for charcoal in the kilns of the New Forest in 1970? I mean, it didn't really occur that one would learn much more than he probably, as I think much has turned out to be the case, they burnt out. But anyway, so there's all of that, the growth of different interests, different specialisms. Each period has the same sorts of issues. And in the context of an undergraduate degree, paying very much attention to the pottery of any particular period is challenging unless one happens to have in the department somebody who is a knowledge expert and who wants to take that forward and to encourage his or her students. And you know, if I look back over my time as a PhD supervisor, there have been, you know, very few, and that's probably just my fault, very few people who've come forward to want to do pottery-based research. I mean, and so there's that, you know, what people's interests take them. There's also the lack of funds. I mean, it's much more of a lottery to get PhD funding now than ever it was. Many more hoops to go through, and that's a serious impediment. And of my last 3 PhD students, you know, 2 have been privately funded. And when you enter the realm of private funding, you're also entering the realm of the interests of the funder. So 2 ceramic topics, one of the 2 came through that person's interest in technology, and the second through that person's interest in Roman building material. So it's a fragile business, and because the undergraduate syllabus has really little opportunity except through occasional specialist involvement, has very little opportunity to get people. I mean, you're lucky if a student will kind of recognize what Roman pottery is by the time they graduate, because they've also got to know something about the significance of environmental evidence, animal bones or something, and so on and so on, subjects which 50 years ago just weren't really there in the university curriculum. So we have to live with that. I think we have to live with that and hope, as in the past, that people will come forward who want to grab the torch of amphory or grab the torch of fabric characterization in the way that David Peacock really brought to the subject so much in the 70s and 80s. Listening earlier on this morning, I was reminded how much help English Heritage, as it was then, gave to the subject, the development of workshops and that kind of thing. And now, historic England has no resource at all. I mean, whatever additional money it gets from DCMS and from the Treasury is focused on individual projects, many of which are really concerned with the built environment, not with the below ground environment. I think what I'm saying there is, looking to the next 50 years, I think it's largely going to be happenstance how things develop. Individuals will become passionately involved with the subject. They will be able to take it forward in particular ways that interest them, but it will not be in any sort of sense a planned way. I mean, the way in which archaeology was being supported back in the latter days before PPG 16. So I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I certainly think the next 50 years. But above all, I think there will be this challenge of lack of people to do the work. If one thinks of the quantity of data that will be coming out of this first stage of HS2, extensive areas of rural settlements, small towns being excavated as we speak, that's, I think, likely to continue for a while. And alongside that, of course, the pressure on housing developments, and all the opportunities that brings. And that, I suppose, means that we're going to have to be yet more selective in what we do. It won't be a question of, and that is of course happening right now, but I think there's going to be even more concentration on where's the best way to spend resources which are not just financial, but are actually trained people who know what they're doing. So that's one challenge, I think, is people, their expertise, the breadth of their expertise, the likely lack of people with very focused specialist interests to support them, and alongside that, the need to keep abreast of what's happening more widely. Of course, related to, as it were, the generational change, and I think this is something that concerns us all, is what happens to our archives. We all have archives. Those practicing as consultants in the profession have really important archives, and that's across the board and goes alongside, if you like, the historic, the great archives, the Samian archives, the Mortaria archives, and so on. And here I'm not talking about the objects. I'm talking about the digital records and the paper records, and how we manage to conserve all that. So I've worked with, as many of you know, worked with Jane Timby for very many years. So if Jane was run over by a bus tomorrow, what would happen to all that data? which she drew on for her contribution to the rural settlement project, but sits on her computer. Who will rescue it and ensure it has a longevity, and roll that out as we're across the country and through the years. And there is a huge potential resource that needs to be curated, conserved. There is, of course, the same issue around the physical archives and what do we keep, what do we chuck, and that subject area is changing all the time. So I think until a few years ago, I would have been, along with many others, thinking that ceramic building material, which is of course one of the most ubiquitous artifacts from southern Britain, ceramic building material couldn't really lend itself to fabric characterization. It's just too difficult, and the most one could do with it was on the basis of typology. And Peter Worry has taken that subject forward in lots of interesting ways. But it is possible to do good work, interesting work on ceramic building material through the study of their fabrics. As my recently, not so recently, but as my former student Sarah Machin has and is demonstrating. So how many sites are being archived now where anybody's actually thinking not just about the oddities, the interesting typological tiles, but also looking at the range of fabrics that they represent and how those might interrelate with other sites in the region. I think looking at what's in collections now, it tends to be stamp tiles with animal footprints. How many dogs are preserved on the tiles of Roman Britain, and so on. So we need to be aware that our knowledge base is changing, and we need to respond to that in what we keep in the way of the artifact collections that we keep. And that's also, I think, true when you think of the impact that residue analysis is having. So many people might say, as they used to say about animal bone, it's of no value, just throw it away, keep it. That was certainly the view right up until the 1970s, so not much more than 50 years ago, as they would with Roman brick and tile, unless it's got a pattern on it that's interesting, chuck it. Don't even quantify it. But residue analysis is another area that's growing. I mean, it's expensive, relatively expensive, but the order of radiocarbon dates, I suppose, something of that order. But that has a lot to tell us about what people were cooking in their pots. And yet it's those very same cooking pots, those greyware cooking pots, that people sort of look disparagingly at and think, well, again, do we need to put this in the archive? But yes, just as animal bones and human bones have so much to tell us about our past, so does humble, rimshod of a cooking pot or a cooking bowl or whatever have to tell us about diet, and that's an underexploited resource, and we must be mindful of that in what we retain. So I think the last sort of area, because I think, my gosh, my time's running out. The last area I wanted to touch upon was what we have now. We've been brilliant in the past in the knowledge we brought to bear on a whole range of subjects. We know a lot about the imports that come into Roman Britain. We know a lot about some of the major producers. We know there's still great gaps. There's still a huge amount of work to be done. But one area where we all, I think, stumble and really find it really difficult, but it may actually be of great significance, is in the study of those awful grey wares or black wares or the commoner wares, cooking wares, kitchen wares, whatever you like to call them, the wares that account for maybe up to half or more of the assemblage from any site. Why can't we make more of that material? It's not very appetizing, but you have to ask it's one of the extraordinary things about the Roman world is that crazy about making pottery. And I reflected, looking at late Roman Silchester, that the commonest artifact by I don't know how much was pottery. And what did a 4th century inhabitant of Silchester have other than pots? I mean, not a lot else really. And where were all these grey wares being made? We know about the bigger producers, the Nen Valley, the Oxford wares, and so on, Alice Holt. But there are loads of other fabrics. And if you have a project of almost national scale, like HS2, as it cuts its way northwards through up to Birmingham and then up to Crewe and so on, you have an opportunity there to try and get to grips. And when you're dealing at the same time, and how this might be managed, I can't begin to imagine, but to actually really focus on those, and to think of them against that question of the role to which, for example, estates might play in the distribution of pottery. Why is there so much pottery from Roman Britain? And clearly wasn't much use, because by the 5th century people got along quite well without pottery. So why is it? What estates were producing it? And was it for their own people? Is this a way of defining estates? And does it help us address some of the questions left by, going back to the Rural Economy of Roman Britain, that Britannia monograph volume, really the question that's left by Jane Timby's study of her material from Gloucestershire and immediately surrounding counties, that when you look at or try and identify the role of towns and other places' markets, it's really difficult to see that such things existed. And so the question is raised, is the answer, does it lie with the estate? And is the estate the means by which materials are disseminated? And we can get some of the way there through the wares that we all know, those which are big regional products or of a national distribution. But what about the rest? What about actually devoting some effort to trying to get a handle on sites which share the same difficult to characterize, but definitely characterizable grey ware or oxidized ware, common ware fabrics? I think that would be, in the way that, in Britain, the subject has moved on so much in the last 50 years, looking ahead to the next 50 years and looking at the kind of projects that are likely to, and the big projects, and I'm sure projects of the scale of HS2 will not be the last, that seems to me to be, it may not be the most exciting way to end my short contribution, but it does seem to me to be really important that this kind of our ceramic iceberg, 2/3 of it or so rests under the water level, and we really need to get a grip on it and see what it can tell us about, get us further into life, into the countryside and interaction with the larger settlements of Roman Britain. So I'd better stop there.